Max had never acted like this before. One second, he was trotting beside Officer Jane Sanders during their routine evening patrol, and the next he tore free, ripping the leash straight from her grip and sprinting toward the abandoned housing block. His sudden burst of energy shattered the quiet night, his growls echoing through the empty alleyways as he lunged at a strange, perfectly rounded hole in an old concrete wall. Jane froze. Max wasn't reckless. He wasn't skittish. He didn't overreact. Not Max. He barked again, louder this time, pressing his paws against the cracked surface like something on the other side was calling to him. Something hidden. Something old. Something that Max recognized long before any human ever could. Hit the subscribe button if you're a dog lover. The night air hovered unnaturally still as Jane finally caught up, breath short, flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam sliced across the wall, illuminating the jagged edges of the hole, no bigger than a child's head, and the scattering of dust Max had kicked up. He wasn't stopping. He wouldn't move. He wouldn't even look at her. "Max, hey boy, what's going on?" Jane whispered. But Max only growled deeper, eyes locked on the hole as if it held a heartbeat. Hours later, she would stand at this same spot, beside a broken wall and a pile of evidence that would shake their entire town. Hours later, Max would be calm again, proud, watching her with steady eyes, as if telling her he'd tried to warn them long ago. But right now, everything was just beginning. Earlier that night, Jane had been walking her usual route behind the old railway line, turning corners she'd walked 1,000 times. Max was beside her, attentive, disciplined, reacting only when necessary. But then he stopped. Completely stopped. His ears shot forward, nose lifted, body rigid. A low vibration rumbled in his throat, so deep, so primal. Jane felt it more than she heard it. "Max," she murmured. Before the word even left her mouth, he lunged. "Max." She chased him through the deserted alley, heart pounding, boots scraping against broken concrete. And if you believe every hidden truth deserves a chance to come to light, you're not alone here. Stick with us. This story isn't just unfolding, it's being uncovered. Max skidded to a halt at the far end of the block, barking hard at the wall. Jane dropped to her knees beside him and angled her flashlight inside the hole. A glint, metal, buried deep within the wall. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't wiring. It wasn't an animal burrow. It was something placed, hidden, sealed away. "Dispatch, I need backup," she said, voice low. "And fire services. Possible concealed object." Max backed away only enough to let her move. His eyes stayed locked on the hole, pupils blown wide, body tense, ready. Within minutes, the firefighters arrived. Heavy boots thudded across the gravel. The saw roared to life, sparks flying as steel bit into concrete. Dust exploded into the air. Chunks of wall cracked and fell away. Max retreated a few steps, barking with a strange mix of urgency and fear, sounds Jane had never heard from him before. The wall began to crumble. Jane swallowed, tightening her grip on the flashlight. "If you're still with Max right now, hit like, so we keep uncovering this mystery together." A final crack split the night. A final piece of concrete crashed to the ground. And something tumbled out of the darkness, metal, rusted, heavy, landing at Jane's boots with a dull, echoing thud. She stared at it, heart hammering. Max went silent. They had just opened the wall. But whatever they released was only the beginning. She reached for the box with trembling fingers. Inside lay a faded Polaroid photograph of a boy no more than 8 years old. A small toy car, a school jacket patch, and a sealed envelope covered in shaky handwriting, the ink faded from age. Jane felt the world tilt around her. Behind her, Max began to bark again, this time at another section of the wall, farther to the left. Louder, more urgent. "Another one," the fire captain muttered. Jane rose slowly, eyes wide, as Max scratched furiously at the second spot. There was more behind the concrete. Much more. She lifted her radio with shaking hands. "Captain, keep cutting." And as the saw roared back to life, she whispered to Max, "What have you found, boy?" Behind the wall, a bricked-off hollow chamber. Not large. Not accidental. Definitely used. A child-sized blanket. A rusted lantern. Scratch marks made by fingernails. A drawing taped to the bricks. Jane tries to process the horrifying implication. This wasn't just storage, it was confinement. A narrated sequence recounting the original disappearance of Jacob Hill. He sits by the chamber entrance, ears pinned, eyes fixed inside. Almost mourning. Forensics announce more layers behind the wall. They aren't done. The saw screamed through the night again, throwing sparks into the air like fireflies being torn apart. Jane stood back, shielding her eyes as another slice of the old concrete wall gave way. Dust spread in thick clouds, clinging to her uniform, her skin, her throat. The air tasted like earth and secrets, heavy, suffocating, ancient. Max didn't move. His body remained pressed close to the wall, ears pinned flat, nose twitching as if he could already smell what was beyond the cement. His growls had faded into a deep, trembling quiet, one that seemed to shake him from the inside out. Jane swallowed hard. Something about the way he watched the wall made her chest tighten. The firefighters worked in steady, brutal cuts, metal straining, concrete cracking, the ground vibrating from the force of it. Every roar of the saw seemed to echo a warning. You're uncovering something that wasn't meant to be touched. Then, crack. A slab of concrete fell inward instead of outward. The firefighters froze. Jane's heart slammed into her ribs. Max stepped forward, nose pressed to the opening. Back, the fire captain called, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He didn't take a single step closer. The dust thinned just enough for Jane to move in with her flashlight. She crouched low, breath tight, and raised the beam inside. She stilled. It wasn't another cavity hidden in the wall. It wasn't storage. It wasn't even an accidental void created by old construction. It was a room. A tiny, bricked-off hollow chamber, barely large enough for a child to sit or curl up in. The bricks on the back side were newer than the surrounding wall, their mortar lighter, smoother. Someone had sealed this space deliberately. Not large. Not accidental. Definitely used. Her stomach clenched as the flashlight beams swept across the interior. A small blanket lay crumpled in the corner, its once bright fabric now dulled with dust and neglect. The faded cartoon characters on it were barely visible, worn away by time and misery. A rusted lantern sat beside it, its glass cracked, its metal frame warped. Jane couldn't imagine it had given much light, even when it was new. But the detail that punched her breath away, hard, were the scratches. Long, desperate claw marks covered the inner bricks. Some deep, some shallow. Some frantic. Some weakening. Small hands had pulled at those bricks. Not adult-sized. Not strong. Child-sized. A sound escaped Jane's throat, something between a gasp and a choke. "Dear God," Morris whispered behind her. Jane moved the flashlight higher. A drawing was taped to the bricks with yellowed masking tape. It held on by luck alone. She leaned in closer. The image seemed to have been made with crayons, shaky coloring, uneven lines. A small boy stood near a tree. Beside him, a dog. Roughly sketched, almost like a German shepherd. Her hands trembled. This wasn't storage. Wasn't a misplaced room. This was a cell. Someone had kept Jacob Hill here. A terrified, 8-year-old boy. Hidden behind a wall. Trapped. Jane felt her throat close. The weight of the realization pressed down on her chest in a suffocating wave. Behind her, Max whimpered. She turned. Max didn't approach the chamber. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He sat, just outside the threshold, staring into the darkness with a stillness that chilled Jane to her bones. His ears were pinned back. His body lowered, tail resting flat on the ground. His head slowly bowed, as if he understood the suffering etched into the walls. He looked like he was mourning. Jane blinked hard, her eyes burning. "Max, it's okay. Come here." But he didn't. He wouldn't. He couldn't. Because something inside that chamber told him to stay exactly where he was. Morris cleared his throat. Jane, there's no way this could have been an accident. Someone built this on purpose. Someone bricked a kid in here. The lantern, the blanket, the scratches, the drawing. Jane knew he was right. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't coincidence. This was confinement. Her mind drifted, unbidden, to the old case files she'd heard whispered about growing up. Officers talking late at night in the station lobby while kids waited for their parents. Neighbors lowering their voices when Jacob Hill's name came up. 25 years ago. A summer carnival. Ice cream stands and Ferris wheel lights. Jacob playing near the ring toss. His mother turning for a few seconds, just a few. When she turned back, he was gone. The search lasted weeks. He was never found. His disappearance became the wound no one wanted to touch. Until now. Jane, Morris said quietly, we may be standing in the last place Jacob was alive. Jane squeezed her eyes shut. Who would do this? But before he could answer, Max suddenly shifted. His head snapped upward. His ears twitched. His nose lifted, sniffing sharply. Then he rose, slowly, deliberately, and walked to the far right corner of the chamber opening. Jane followed his gaze. The bricks there looked wrong. Different. Not as tightly sealed. Even from outside, she could see faint dust trails where Max's nose had brushed earlier, like he'd sensed something there long before the saw even made the first cut. Captain, Jane said, her voice steadying even as her stomach knotted. Check the right side. Max's signaling again. The captain studied Max's posture, the rigid stance, the laser-focused stare, and didn't waste time arguing. All right, tools up. Let's open it. As they prepped the saw again, Jane stood beside Max. You knew this wasn't just a box, she whispered. You knew there was more behind that wall. Max didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the bricks. A low rumble vibrated in his chest. Jane rested her hand on his back. Whatever you're leading us to, we're going to face it together. The saw roared to life again, carving new lines into the ancient cement. Dust filled the air in thick waves. Jane stepped back, arms shielding her eyes as the vibration of the machinery shook the ground beneath them. Cracks snaked across the wall like veins of dark lightning. Pieces began to fall. A firefighter shouted, "It's hollow again." "Keep going," Jane called out. Max barked, once sharp and decisive. The team pushed on. Concrete peeled away in jagged slabs. Darkness seeped out from behind the wall like breath from a sleeping monster. The moment the final piece dropped, Max stopped barking. Everyone turned. Standing amid the dust, a forensic technician removed his mask, pale, shaken. "Detective," he said, voice wavering, "there are multiple layers." Jane's heart froze. "What?" The tech swallowed hard. "The chamber we opened isn't the only one." Morris stepped closer. "You mean?" "There are more rooms," the tech said. "Smaller ones. Sealed. Hidden deeper within the structure." He looked at Jane directly, fear etched into his expression. "We're not done. Not even close." Jane looked at Max, who stared straight into the darkness as if he'd known all along that the horror behind the wall was much bigger than anyone imagined. The hum of generators, the strobing of police lights, and the low murmur of gathering officers swallowed the once empty lot. What had started as a simple patrol interruption was now an active crime scene, one pulling in half the department. Forensic tents went up. Camera flashes burst like tiny lightning strikes. And the hollow chambers inside the wall, multiple of them, loomed like open mouths in the darkness. Max stayed close to Jane, tail low, shoulders tense, gaze glued to the wall as though he expected it to speak. Detective Larson, a tall man with a face permanently set into a stern scowl, approached Jane with a stack of printouts under his arm. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. Jane didn't look away from the wall. "Just one." Larson exhaled heavily. "Try dozens." He handed her the files. Old missing persons cases. Faded photographs paper-clipped to thin reports. Dates going back decades. Children. Teenagers. A few adults. "Why are you giving me these?" Jane asked. "Because," Larson replied, jerking his chin toward the wall. The forensic team believes some of the items in your first box match descriptions from multiple unsolved disappearances. And we're not just talking Jacob Hill. Jane felt the air leave her lungs. Larson lowered his voice. Media's already circling the block. They smell blood. We haven't even secured the perimeter properly. As if on cue, a news van rolled into view at the end of the street, headlights cutting through the fog. Reporters spilled from the side doors with cameras raised, voices climbing over one another. Jane stepped between them and the wall. She didn't want the world to see what was behind it, not until the truth made sense. But truth wasn't waiting. It was surfacing. Morris jogged toward them, breath visible in the cold night air. Jane, you need to hear this. He handed her a yellowing folder with brittle edges. The tab read, Crane Property Development, 1985. Crane? Jane repeated. Harold Crane, Morris said. That building belonged to him. Jane blinked, stunned. Everyone knew that name. Harold Crane. Beloved philanthropist. Fundraiser. Church donor. Community protector. The man had sponsored scholarships, repaired playgrounds, hosted holiday dinners for families who couldn't afford them. He was practically a local saint. He owned this building? Jane asked, barely trusting her voice. For 30 years, Morris replied. Bought it cheap in the 80s. Lived in the penthouse for a while before moving out of state. Died in 2011. The world seemed to tilt. Harold Crane. The man everyone praised. The man no one suspected. The man with access to this building when the first disappearing began. Larson crossed his arms. His renovation permits were unusual. How unusual? Jane asked. Larson flipped open another file. He didn't hire contractors. Not a single one. Every renovation permit lists his name, and only his name. He did the structural work himself. Jane stared at the wall, at the chambers carved like hidden graves. Crane had done that. With his own hands. While everyone thought he was building homes in hope. The chilling realization settled in her stomach like ice. He sealed those rooms, she whispered. Morris nodded grimly. He had access. Privacy. Opportunity. And victims, Larson added quietly. Jane swallowed hard. The taste of concrete dust still lingered on her tongue. She needed answers, real ones, not assumptions, not half-formed nightmares. She turned to Morris. I want to talk to people who lived here back then. Anyone still around. Already ahead of you, he said. There's an elderly woman next door, Mrs. Rudd. Says she lived in the building in 1999. She's been watching us from her window since the first wall came down. Jane gave Max a quick pat. Come on, partner. Let's go hear what she's been holding in. Max followed close, ears flicking, body alert. He acted less like he was walking and more like he was being drawn toward something, an unseen current guiding him. The building next door was quiet, its faded siding lit only by dim porch lights. Mrs. Rudd answered the door before Jane could knock. She was in her late 80s, wrapped in a quilt and holding a mug as if it were the only thing keeping her warm. I knew someone would come asking eventually, she said, voice shaky. Jane offered a gentle smile. Ma'am, we're just looking for information. Anything you remember could help. Mrs. Rudd's eyes drifted past Jane to Max, sitting loyally at her side. The old woman's face softened. He looks like the other one. Jane blinked. The other what? Mrs. Rudd stepped out of the doorway, her quilt dragging against the floor. There was a dog. Years ago. A German shepherd like yours. He used to scratch at that wall too. Barked at it every night. Jane's heart stuttered. Max let out a low whine, ears raising. Mrs. Rudd continued, voice trembling as she stared at the condemned building. People thought the dog was sick. Or losing its mind. They told the owner to keep it inside. But that poor thing, it was trying to tell us something. Jane felt the hairs rise along her arms. What did you hear, Mrs. Rudd? She asked softly. The old woman hesitated. Then, with a fragile breath, she whispered, I heard tapping. Jane stilled. What kind of tapping? Mrs. Rudd's eyes grew wet. Light tapping. Like little fingers on a wall. I heard it for weeks. Always the same time at night. Always from that side of the building. Jane felt as though the world had narrowed to a pinpoint. Did you tell anyone? She asked. Mrs. Rudd let out a bitter laugh. What was I going to tell them? That walls were tapping back at me? That a child was trapped? They thought I was losing my mind. I was 55, not ancient, but still no one believed me. Her voice broke. And then the tapping stopped. Max pressed closer to the woman's leg, as if comforting her. Jane looked back toward the wall. The chambers behind it, the drawing, the scratches. The weight of everything Mrs. Rudd had said pressed down on her chest. Crane had built the walls. Crane had sealed them. Crane had lived above the quiet tapping of a terrified child. Jane's throat tightened. Mrs. Rudd, is there anything else? Anything you remember about Crane? The woman nodded slowly. He was polite. Kind, even. Helped neighbors carry groceries. But sometimes I saw him at night. In the hallway. Covered in dust. Like he'd been building something. Jane's grip tightened around her flashlight. Thank you, she whispered. Mrs. Rudd touched her arm. Don't let them forget the children. People forgot too fast last time. Jane swallowed hard. We won't. She and Max walked back toward the crime scene. The reporters had multiplied, their voices buzzing like insects. Detectives combed through documents, walls, debris, pulling everything they could into the search. Larson met her halfway across the lot. Jane, he said, forensics found something else. Max stiffened beside her. What is it? She asked. Larson's expression hardened, fear flickering beneath the surface. There are more chambers. Jane felt her pulse thud in her ears. How many? Larson held her gaze for a long moment before answering. As of now, at least 5 more. Jane's breath caught. And Jane, Larson added quietly, none of them are empty. The night fell silent around her. Even the reporters quieted. Max sat down, staring at the wall with the same mournful certainty as before. The truth wasn't finished revealing itself. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a graveyard. Jane's office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, a reminder that some things never changed, even in a world where fear had wrapped itself around the town like a second skin. She sat, replaying the footage from Max's first unusual behavior outside the abandoned building. Frame by frame, she watched him sniff the air, pivot his head sharply, and tense as if he'd heard whispers humans couldn't. It wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. Max, she murmured, leaning closer to the monitor. The dog's eyes glinted in the grainy footage, alert, almost human in their intensity. Jane's fingers hovered over the controls, pausing at the moment when Max stopped mid-step, his paw raised as though frozen by invisible chains. Were you seeing that I can't? She rewound, slowing the playback to a crawl. A shadow flickered across the wall behind him, the wind making the peeling paint sway, but that wasn't it. Max's focus was precise, deliberate. He wasn't reacting to the wind. He was following something, someone. Or perhaps something left behind. Jane's pulse quickened. There was a rhythm to his movements, a pattern she hadn't noticed until now. Every turn, every sniff at the ground, seemed to trace a path, leading away from the main entrance, then circling back, then cutting sharply toward the side yard. Her hand tightened on the mouse as she took notes. Max wasn't just a companion. He was a guide, a living key to the town's buried secrets. The next morning, she decided to follow him outside again, this time with the intention of documenting every move. The air was thick with fog, the kind that makes familiar places feel alien. Max bounded ahead, nose to the ground, ears twitching at sounds only he could perceive. Jane trailed behind, her boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. A small, rusted key emerged from the dirt, its teeth worn down as though it had unlocked countless doors decades ago. Jane held it carefully, trying not to imagine what it might open. Good boy, Max, she whispered, her voice almost reverent. The dog wagged his tail but kept his nose to the ground, eager, insistent. The sequence continued. Max led her to a tangle of rusted chains, half buried beneath the grass. They looked decades old, their links fused with corrosion, as though waiting for someone to remember. Jane crouched beside them, imagining their story, what they had bound, and who had been imprisoned. The wind stirred, whispering through the trees, as if urging her onward. Then Max stopped again, stiffening near a pile of debris by the edge of the property. Jane's stomach knotted when her eyes landed on it. A single child's shoe, faded and cracked, lay in the dirt as though someone had kicked it off in a hurry. The memory of missing children cases she had read about flashed through her mind. She picked up the shoe with gloved hands, the leather brittle under her touch. It wasn't just a shoe. It was a signal, a breadcrumb left behind for those who remembered how to follow. Jane felt a lump in her throat. Max's eyes met hers, almost knowingly, and for the first time, she felt that the weight he carried wasn't just instinct, it was memory. The forgotten boy. The lost children. Max remembered them, and through him, Jane could feel their absence like a cold shadow pressing against her ribs. They returned to the property line, where the wall had long stood like a silent sentinel. Jane noticed something she hadn't before. The ground beneath the ivy seemed uneven, as though it had been disturbed repeatedly. Max sniffed and pawed at a section near the base, digging carefully. Jane knelt beside him, brushing aside the soil and leaves. Beneath the surface, she uncovered a small lockbox, heavy with rust but intact. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted it. The key she had found fit perfectly. With a click that echoed strangely in the misty morning, the lock released, revealing the contents inside. A folded map, yellowed with age, fell into her hands. The ink was faded, but the lines were precise, almost meticulous. Paths and corridors crisscrossed the property, and one route led beyond the wall, toward a structure that was not marked on any current map. The building had been erased from memory, erased from history, but here it was, waiting to be rediscovered. Jane traced the map with her finger, her mind racing. Max nudged her shoulder, as if to say, "I've been trying to show you this all along." The emotional weight pressed on her chest. The dog had not just been chasing sense. He had been chasing memory, chasing the echoes of a boy humans had forgotten. And in doing so, he had led her to something bigger, something that promised answers and danger. Hours passed as they continued the search. Max guided her to smaller, subtler markers along the property. A loose brick with scratches forming letters no one alive could remember, a tree with carvings too faint to be deciphered from a distance, and a hollow where sounds seemed to carry longer than they should. Each discovery built a story that had been whispered only to the wind for decades, a story Max seemed determined for Jane to hear. By late afternoon, Jane sat on the porch of the abandoned building, the map unfolded beside her. Max rested his head on her lap, his eyes weary but satisfied. She ran her fingers over the dog's fur, feeling the deep connection forming between them. He wasn't just a police K-9. He was a vessel of memory, a bridge to what the town had forgotten, and slowly, painfully, she began to understand the weight he carried. Her thoughts drifted to the forgotten boy. Who had he been? Why had he been erased from memory? And what was beyond the wall that the map hinted at? Max's persistence was no longer merely curiosity, it was duty. And now, that duty had become hers as well. Jane looked at him, softening. "I don't know if I can do this alone, Max. But I think I'll try." She stroked his head, feeling the steady warmth of his presence. His tail thumped against the floorboards in acknowledgement, a silent vow that they would face whatever was hidden together. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the property. Jane rolled up the map carefully, tucking it into her jacket. She felt the weight of discovery and the faint pulse of hope. The pieces were coming together, painful, fragmented, and fragile, but together, she and Max were beginning to assemble the picture. And in the quiet that settled over the abandoned lot, Jane realized something else. Max remembered what humans had forgotten. And she was beginning to remember, too. Tomorrow, they would follow the map. Tomorrow, the wall would no longer be a boundary, but a gateway. And whatever lay beyond it, they would face it together. For now, though, Jane allowed herself a moment to breathe. To simply sit with Max, feeling the unspoken bond grow stronger. A bond formed not by commands or training, but by trust, shared grief, and the memory of a child lost to time. Max lifted his head, ears pricked, and let out a low, satisfied growl. Jane smiled softly. She didn't need words to understand him. They were ready. And somewhere, deep in the shadowed corners of the town, something long forgotten began to stir. The morning air was sharp with frost, but Jane barely noticed as the excavation crew moved in. Bulldozers and shovels tore at the earth with relentless precision, uncovering the outline of what had long been hidden beneath the abandoned property. Max prowled alongside, nose close to the ground, tail stiff with anticipation. The dog had led her here, and now the secrets beneath the soil were finally surfacing. The crew uncovered a section of reinforced flooring beneath the old building. Jane knelt by the fractured tiles, brushing away debris, her heart pounding. The tiles were arranged in a deliberate pattern, almost like a chessboard, and at the center was a faintly rusted handle. She exchanged a glance with the crew leader, who shrugged. "Looks old. Should we open it?" Jane nodded, heart hammering. Max growled softly, circling her as she gripped the handle and lifted. The hatch groaned but yielded, revealing a corridor that descended into darkness. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Jane switched on her flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path into the shadows. Max stepped forward confidently, ears alert. The corridor stretched farther than Jane expected, walls lined with streaks and scratches, as if someone, or something, had clawed at the stone in silent panic. At the end of the passage was another hatch, smaller and reinforced. Rusted locks barred the way. Jane crouched beside it, examining the metal. There were no ordinary keyholes. This required careful manipulation. "Looks like the boy left us more than just a map," she murmured. Max nudged her shoulder, as if in agreement. After careful effort, and using the rusted key Max had uncovered, the hatch opened to reveal a second chamber. The room was small, suffocatingly enclosed, but filled with relics that made Jane's stomach twist. Old toys, dolls' missing eyes, drawings plastered across the walls, and more than a few items she couldn't immediately identify. Every object carried the weight of fear, but also of memory, of someone trying desperately to be remembered. Jane's flashlight landed on the walls. The boy's drawings sprawled across them, crude yet urgent. Scenes of the property, of hidden corridors and strange figures. One that resembled a man in a top hat, watching, waiting. The precision and repetition suggested obsession, or perhaps a desperate attempt to map a nightmare that had been lived. Near the far corner, a small device caught her eye. A recording device, its casing coated in dust but intact. Jane carefully pressed the play button. Static filled the air. Then a low, trembling voice spoke. "Don't let them forget nights alone afraid." The voice quavered, breaking into silence, then resumed in clipped bursts, describing places, times, and cryptic warnings. Jane's hands shook slightly. The recordings weren't just evidence. They were a time capsule of terror. Max pressed closer to her, protective, aware of the weight in the room. A notebook lay next to the device, its cover faded and corners frayed. Jane opened it, discovering pages filled with coded entries, strings of numbers, symbols, and dates. At first glance, they seemed nonsensical, but as she flipped through, a pattern emerged. Each sequence corresponded to specific nights when Crane, the town's respected benefactor, had disappeared from public events. Jane's blood ran cold. The codes weren't random. They were a meticulous record of movement and control, documenting when Crane had carried out unspeakable acts under the guise of philanthropy. Anger surged through her, hot and sharp. How many had been lost behind smiles and donations? How many had suffered while the town praised the man as a hero? She leaned against the wall, notebook in hand, letting the fury mix with disbelief. Max pressed his head against her arm, a grounding presence. The boy, Max remembered him, remembered every detail the world had tried to erase. And now, Jane remembered too. Her eyes scanned the room again, absorbing the scale of what had been hidden. The chamber wasn't just a room, It was a shrine of secrecy, meticulously curated to keep memory alive for those capable of deciphering it. Jane felt the enormity of the task before her. She couldn't just take photographs or file a report. She had to understand every nuance, every piece of the puzzle, if justice was to be served. She began cataloging the items systematically. The drawings, the recordings, the notebook, even the small toys that seemed insignificant but held clues to the boy's experience. Each object connected like pieces of a dark mosaic, slowly revealing the extent of Crane's hidden life. Jane paused at a drawing depicting a network of corridors, including the hatch they had just opened. Numbers were scrawled in the margins, dates aligning with the notebook entries. Her mind raced. If the boy had mapped these places carefully, he had known what Crane wanted hidden. He had also left Max behind to guide someone who could piece it together. The room seemed to breathe around her. Each discovery was both revelation and burden. Jane's pulse matched the rhythm of the boy's memory, echoing in her chest. Max shifted closer, his eyes scanning the corners as if anticipating further surprises. The dog's intuition had been right. This hideout wasn't a single room or a single secret. It was a network of horrors, meticulously concealed, and yet painstakingly chronicled by the child who had suffered within it. Jane clenched the notebook in one hand, flashlight in the other, her mind already working through the coded sequences. She began mapping them on paper, connecting dates, locations, and the cryptic notes. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The codes weren't arbitrary. They pointed to specific nights, marking when Crane disappeared from the public eye to execute actions no one would suspect. The magnitude of Crane's duplicity, hidden behind charitable work and public smiles, made Jane's stomach churn. The room was silent, save for Max's soft breathing and the distant hum of excavation above. Jane felt the anger simmering beneath the surface, directed at the man who had manipulated the town's trust, at the adults who had ignored whispers, at herself for only now uncovering the full truth. Max nudged her again, and she exhaled sharply, realizing the dog had brought her here not only to discover the physical hideout, but to guide her into understanding the emotional weight she would carry. She wasn't just piecing together a crime scene. She was reconstructing the life of a child the world had tried to erase. Jane's eyes met Max's, and she whispered softly, almost to herself, "We'll get it right. We'll remember him." Max pressed his head against her shoulder, and for the first time since uncovering the hatch, Jane allowed herself to feel something other than anger, resolve. Above them, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows into the corridor. Jane glanced once more at the notebook, then at the recordings and the scattered relics. Each piece was a key, a thread leading into a larger truth. The hideout was more than a room, more than a secret. It was a testament to the horrors humans preferred to ignore, and a challenge to anyone willing to face the darkness. Jane closed the notebook carefully, tucking it under her arm. "We're just getting started," she murmured. Max gave a low, affirming growl, tail sweeping the dust-covered floor. Together, they stepped back into the corridor, toward the hatch, toward the surface, and toward a town that had forgotten far too much. The true scale of the hideout was now clear, and the deeper they dug, the darker the world above seemed. The last layer of the wall crumbled under the weight of the excavators, dust rising like smoke in the dim evening light. Jane shielded her eyes, Max at her side, ears alert, pawing at the fresh debris. The moment they had been edging toward, years of lost memories, decades of forgotten horrors, was finally before them. Beneath the rubble, a wooden compartment, sealed and warped with age, emerged. Jane knelt carefully, examining the rough planks. The air smelled of mildew and old earth, thick with the weight of secrets that had been buried too long. She tried the rusty latch. It resisted at first, then gave with a sharp click. Inside, the scene froze her blood. A child's skeletal remains lay curled, as if trying to protect himself from the world, a silent testimony to fear and neglect. Jane swallowed hard, her stomach twisting. The bones were small, delicate, yet somehow resilient in their stillness, frozen in the moment they had finally stopped struggling. Beside the remains, she spotted a necklace, its chain brittle but intact. On it hung a tiny pendant, engraved with initials. Jane's breath caught. Jacob, the boy whose memory Max had carried, whose fear had guided them through the corridors, the drawings, and the maps. Every clue had led here, every step guided by instinct and memory. Her hands trembled as she picked up a tape recorder from the compartment. It was dust-coated but intact. She clicked the play button, and a static-filled hiss filled the air before a small, terrified voice emerged. "Please don't. I can't. I'm scared." Jane recognized the boy's tone instantly. Jacob's voice, high-pitched and quivering, filled with terror that had no audience except the walls. Then another voice, smooth and chilling, cut through the tape. "Do exactly as I say. Not a word to anyone. If you tell, there will be consequences. You understand." Jacob's stifled sobs followed, the sound raw, human, and unbearable. Jane clenched the recorder tighter, her knuckles white. The tape continued, detailing instructions from Crane. Where to hide, what to observe, who to trust, and, most horrifyingly, the consequences of disobedience. It was meticulous, calculated, and devoid of any trace of humanity. Jane sank to her knees, shoulders shaking, tears streaking her dirt-smeared face. The truth was undeniable. The town's golden figure, its charitable savior, had orchestrated horrors in the shadows. The notebook, the drawings, the hidden chambers, they weren't just remnants of a child's imagination. They were proof. Unassailable, devastating proof. Max nudged her gently, his eyes steady, grounding. The dog didn't cry, didn't waver. He had led her to this, and now he simply stayed, a silent guardian. Jane buried her face against his fur, letting her sobs shake her frame. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what they had uncovered. The compartment's air seemed heavy, pressing down on her chest, yet in the stillness, Jane began to understand the full scope of what had been hidden. Crane's deeds had spanned years, concealed behind philanthropy, public smiles, and donations. The town's past, its collective memory, was built on lies and silence. She rose slowly, wiping her tears, turning to look at Max. "We have to tell them," she whispered. "Everyone has to know." Max pressed his head to her hand, tail thumping in quiet agreement. Together, they had unearthed what no one else could, what the world had tried to forget. Jane gathered the necklace and the tape recorder, carefully placing them in her bag. The skeletal remains were left untouched for forensic teams. The evidence had to be preserved. Yet as she looked at Max, she realized this wasn't just about proof. It was about memory. Jacob's fear, his bravery, his survival in death, it had to be remembered. Above ground, the town had been waiting, oblivious to the true horrors buried beneath their streets. The wall that had once separated past from present was gone. The barrier protecting the town's perception of itself had crumbled along with it. Jane felt the weight of that revelation settle over her. Every neighbor, every friend, every person who had believed in Crane's generosity would have to confront the truth. The night deepened, and the chill of the air cut through Jane's jacket. She stayed with Max, listening as the wind rustled through the exposed property, carrying echoes of the past. Somewhere in the distance, lights flickered as the excavation continued, but she barely noticed. The world had shifted beneath her feet, and there was no turning back. Finally, Jane pressed her hand against Max's neck, feeling the warmth beneath her fingers. "We did it," she said softly. "We remembered him. And now, the world will too." Max leaned into her, silent but resolute, a steady anchor amid the chaos of revelation. The town would never be the same. Crane's carefully constructed image was shattered, replaced by the horror of the truth. Jane knew the fallout would be immense, that people would scream, deny, or flee from the reality of what had been hidden in plain sight. But there was no going back. The memory of Jacob, preserved in the bones, the necklace, the tape, and Max's unyielding instincts, demanded acknowledgement. As she stepped away from the compartment, Jane felt a strange mixture of grief and resolve. The past was no longer a shadow to be ignored. It was a beacon, a call to action. Max walked beside her, paused silent on the broken earth, guiding her toward what would come next. The night had connected everything, the hidden chambers, the child's memories, the code of silence Crane had relied upon, and the bond between Jane and Max. It was a turning point. The town's entire understanding of its past, of its heroes and its monsters, was about to be rewritten. Jane looked back one last time at the compartment, now open to the world. She whispered to Jacob, to Max, to the silent bones that had waited decades for justice. "You're not forgotten anymore. Not tonight. Not ever." Max gave a low, approving growl, and together they walked toward the lights of the town, ready to confront the truth that could no longer be hidden. The town had awakened to a truth it had long refused to see. Headlines screamed of betrayal and horror, of a man who had lived as a hero while orchestrating unimaginable crimes in secret. Crane's philanthropic empire was under investigation, his carefully curated public persona shattered, and Jane found herself at the center of it all. Authorities reopened old cases, dusting off evidence that had lain untouched for decades. Witness statements were re-examined, and patterns emerged that had been invisible under the weight of complacency. Crane had not acted alone, nor had his reach been limited to one child. Jane knew in her bones that the investigation was only beginning, that every lead they uncovered could reveal more victims whose voices had been silenced. Max moved with her as they visited different sites, always alert, always aware. The dog's instincts were celebrated openly now. Reporters, once skeptical of the police K-9, now hailed him as the key to cracking a case that had confounded generations of detectives. Max's calm confidence and unerring sense of memory and truth had transformed him from companion to hero. Jane couldn't help but smile every time she saw him receive quiet pats and nods of respect from officers and journalists alike. Families began to come forward, some hesitant, some trembling with relief at finally finding someone who would listen. Jane met with parents who had long mourned children declared missing, and siblings who had lived with unanswered questions and guilt. Every story was a thread, weaving a tapestry of grief, fear, and, finally, recognition. Max stayed near her side through each meeting, a silent guardian of memory, his presence providing comfort that words could not. The emotional weight of it all hit Jane hardest when she visited Jacob's surviving relatives. They lived in a modest home on the outskirts of town, walls lined with photographs and mementos that told stories of happier times. Jane knocked softly, her hands shaking as she clutched the evidence bag containing Jacob's necklace. A woman answered, eyes widening as she saw Jane, then softened with recognition. You found him?" she whispered, voice trembling. Jane nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, I found Jacob, and I have something that belonged to him." She held out the necklace. The woman's hands trembled as she took it, pressing it to her chest as tears streamed down her face. Words failed her, and Jane understood. There was nothing to say that could undo the past. But acknowledgement mattered. Recognition mattered. Jacob's life, however brief, had not been erased. They sat together for hours, talking quietly. Jane recounted the discoveries, careful to share only what was necessary, leaving space for grief and memory. Max rested his head on Jane's lap, offering quiet companionship. The woman reached down, stroking his fur, whispering thanks as if she could somehow extend her gratitude through him. Jane felt the weight lift slightly. Closure, she realized, would never be complete, but this was a beginning. Meanwhile, the authorities pieced together the scope of Crane's actions. Each new revelation caused shockwaves through the town. Places once considered safe were re-examined, events that had seemed innocuous were revisited, and Jane's meticulous documentation became the backbone of the investigation. She had become the face of the long-overdue reckoning, the embodiment of a pursuit for truth and justice that had finally found its champion. Max continued to astound everyone. From sniffing out hidden compartments to recognizing patterns only he could perceive, his contributions were undeniable. At the press conference announcing the reopening of the investigations, Jane stood beside him, hand resting on his broad back, and watched as the media acknowledged the dog who had remembered what humans had forgotten. Max sat with quiet dignity, accepting pats and accolades with the solemnity of a veteran soldier. Even as the town grappled with the magnitude of the truth, Jane found solace in small victories. Families were finally able to visit sites previously sealed off, speak with investigators, and reclaim fragments of their lost histories. Jane guided them gently, respecting their boundaries, helping them confront what had been buried, both literally and figuratively, for 25 years. The days were long, emotionally draining, but each revelation brought a sense of balance to the scales. Crane's network of secrets was unraveling, and the town's collective memory, once obscured by fear and denial, began to realign. Jane felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that Jacob's story, and the stories of others like him, would no longer be forgotten. One evening, after a particularly grueling session with families recounting the past, Jane and Max walked along the edge of the property. The wind was cold, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. Jane knelt, resting her hand on the dog's head, letting the silence envelop them. "We did it, Max," she murmured. "We gave them back their memory. We gave them justice." Max nudged her hand with his nose, eyes bright and knowing, as if to confirm that while the journey had been painful, it had been necessary. Together, they had uncovered what had been hidden, remembered what had been forgotten, and begun the process of healing a town that had been trapped in shadows for too long. In that quiet moment, Jane understood something fundamental. The pursuit of justice wasn't about revenge or recognition. It was about acknowledgement, about honoring the lives that had been stolen from time and memory. And as Max rested his head on her knee, she knew that, at least for now, they had begun to restore that balance. The town would never forget again. And neither would she. Dawn crept across the town, painting the broken wall in hues of gold and rose. The air carried a chill, softened by the promise of warmth, and the first birdsong echoed across the quiet streets. Jane stood beside the demolished property, Max at her side, his large frame calm and steady. The scene mirrored the very morning they had first stepped onto the property, but now, the fear and shadows of the past had been replaced by fragile light and hard-won clarity. At the center of the clearing, freshly poured concrete bore a small, polished memorial plaque. The letters gleamed softly in the morning sun. "In memory of Jacob A., whose courage and innocence remind us that even the smallest voice must be heard." Jane knelt, tracing the engraved words with her gloved fingers. The wind whispered past her, carrying faint echoes of the boy's laughter, his fear, and his determination. She could almost hear him urging her forward, guiding her through the labyrinth of deception, teaching her what it meant to fight for memory itself. Max nudged her shoulder, pressing his head against her arm. Jane smiled softly, letting her hand rest atop his fur. The dog had led her to truth after truth, following instincts no human could replicate. Without him, Jacob's story might have remained buried, lost to the years. Jane felt the weight of that realization, mingled with gratitude and awe. She stood, sweeping her gaze across the site. The wall lay in rubble, the compartment exposed to the morning light. It had once hidden unspeakable horrors, now replaced by remembrance and transparency. The town had begun to heal in its own way. Neighbors spoke openly, families shared memories, and the fear that had once suffocated their streets was slowly lifting. Jane's thoughts drifted to Jacob, imagining the courage it had taken for him to leave behind the marks, the codes, the traces of himself. He had been a child alone against a darkness no one should endure, yet his fear had not silenced him. He had left clues for someone to follow, for someone like Max, and for someone like her, to ensure his life, and the horrors he endured, would not vanish. The memorial felt like more than stone and metal. It was acknowledgement, justice, and promise all at once. Jane could see the townspeople arriving quietly, some lingering at the edges, others standing solemnly beside their own memories. They did not need words. The sight of the wall, the plaque, and the open sky spoke for itself. Jane exhaled slowly, the wind tugging at her jacket. "It wasn't easy, Max," she murmured. "And it won't be easy for them either. But it's happening." The truth, it finally clawed its way out. Max leaned fully against her, a solid, unwavering presence. She placed her hand on his neck, feeling the warmth beneath her fingers, the rhythm of his heartbeat a steady anchor in the fragile morning. "You did good, partner," she whispered. His tail thumped softly against the rubble, and for a moment, the world felt balanced. The sun climbed higher, spilling light across the demolished wall and illuminating the town beyond. Jane's reflection wandered over everything they had uncovered: the skeletal remains, the notebook of coded entries, the recordings that had captured Jacob's terror. Each piece had revealed layers of truth hidden behind decades of fear and denial. And yet, amidst the grief and horror, there was triumph. The town had faced its shadow and, slowly, begun to reclaim itself. She knelt once more, brushing a hand across the plaque. Tears welled unbidden, but they were not only for sorrow. They were for recognition, for courage, for the child who had survived in memory long enough for justice to finally reach him. She imagined Jacob standing beside her in spirit, nodding, finally at peace, finally remembered. Max shifted, nudging her hand again, reminding her of his constant vigilance, of the bond forged in the darkest corners of the town, and now resting in the light of morning. Jane pressed her forehead against his head, inhaling the familiar scent of fur and earth, grounding herself in the quiet victory they had earned together. She rose slowly, letting her eyes wander over the demolished property, the memorial, and the awakening town. Everything had changed: the hidden corridors of the hideout, the secrets buried beneath walls, and the town itself. But something deeper remained intact: the courage to face what had been forgotten, and the willingness to remember. As the sun fully rose, Jane took a deep breath. The day felt heavy with possibility, the weight of the past softened by the knowledge that acknowledgement, truth, and memory had been restored. Max pressed once more against her leg, and she knelt briefly to whisper again, a private affirmation of everything they had endured. "You did good, partner," she said, voice steady, carrying across the quiet dawn. Max responded with a soft whine, ears flicked, tail brushing against the ground, his way of saying he understood. Together, they had faced the darkness, uncovered the hidden truths, and begun the long, slow work of healing. Jane stood at last, the light warming her face. The demolished wall behind her was no longer a symbol of fear, but of endurance and remembrance. She glanced down at Max, feeling the deep, unspoken connection between them, the instincts, the memories, the courage, and the bond that had guided them both to this moment. The town stirred behind them, life moving forward, fragile but unbroken. Jane took a final glance at the plaque, whispered one last acknowledgement to Jacob, and let the wind carry her gratitude. Sunrise against the broken wall was no longer the start of fear. It was the beginning of remembrance, justice, and hope. And at her side, Max stood steady, unwavering, a silent hero in the story of a town finally learning to remember.